Kia ora everyone, and welcome to our conversation today about supporting young Kiwis through grief. Now, my name is Nic Russell. I'm the founder of Kenzies Gift. I founded Kenzies Gift back in 2008 after both myself and my 3-year-old daughter went through cancer, and she tragically died at the end of that year. A hand grenade went off in my life at that time, but not just my life, my son, Connor, who was 5 at the time. Grief. So when grief happens to a family, it happens to everyone in the family. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how we can actually live our lives with grief and how we can support our young people through their grief so they can have a good, fulfilling life as they move forward into their future. So joining me today is our child and adolescent psychotherapist, Nicola Jackson. Okay, so Nicola, over to you.
Tēnā koe, Nic. Kia ora koutou. Welcome, everybody. Warm welcome to everybody. I guess, Nic, before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge you and Kenzie and Connor and our teenagers that we're here to talk about. And as we get started, I think, just to take a moment to reflect on those young people and our love for them and our desire to help them live through something which is a natural part of life but can seem very unfair and not the experience that we would have wanted for them so young in their life. And I'd like to acknowledge in particular the people who have passed already, like Kenzie, and the people that we've loved and who have come before us. And I'd like to do that by reading a poem by Selina Tusitala-Marsh. She's a New Zealand poet of European and Pacifica descent. And this poem is written about, it's called Kaina Leaping Point. And it's written about Oahu in Hawaii. So here it is. Albatross toss about in the wind above my head. They play with air currents. I play with myth. Their chicks not yet mobile, flicked beaks up and down near the round monk seals, slabs of silver velveteen sunning. Nearby yellow-faced bees ease into low-lying salmon-coloured ojai. Beyond salty mists, whales breach, then burst, spouting stars into the sky. I stand on the shore's jutting tableau tongue. I am a vow. Ah! Wide-armed, open-mouthed, eyeing into the va. A breeze carries sacred echoes back. But not mine, not yet. I am still unleapt. And I think she's describing the sacred echoes back, perhaps her continuing relationship with her loved ones who've passed into another realm.
Well, it was a beautiful way to start the conversation, Nicola, and that was a beautiful poem, and I think resonates with all of us that have been touched, by a deep loss, and the grief that we're living with, and it's just as hard on young people. I think, like, whenever it happens to us as adults, we can become consumed, as rightly so, because it is so painful. We are in ourselves, and we all grieve individually. It's not a shared thing, grief, because how we deal with it, how our personalities are, we are all different. So within a family, while we're all collectively together, we are all grieving individually. And it was interesting, I heard a conversation from a young man recently who'd lost his brother, and he shared the story, like friends of his family had come out and said, "Oh, so how's your parents doing?" And he went, "Well, probably as terribly as me, I would imagine." People forget it happened to him too. And I think that's what we've got to remember. The grief just doesn't happen to the adults in the family, the parents, or it happens to the young people and the children as well. And it's remembering that, when we don't mean to ignore it, but it's actually, when he said it like that, it was like, oh my goodness, it's so true. And I think, I know even me now, Nicola, so I don't think we're coming today with answers on how to do grief. It's but hopefully what we can come with today from a personal experience and your professional experience, Nicola, is how we can support our young people through grief. And for me, what I learned as a parent early on was to be honest, right from Connor was little, and still now when we're facing other life challenges, life-limiting illnesses, it's always being honest. And because I think if you're not honest, our young people can't trust us, and if the trust is broken, they need that security to know, actually, this is tough stuff, but you're being honest with me, and you're giving me the power, to be able to work through this, and you're being there and you're hearing me and you're trusting me with this big stuff. So I think that's really important. And it's and I think for me, what I've learned as being a parent of parenting through grief is modeling grief for Connor. And I think that's really what we can do as adults is to be able to model the grief for them. And I think talking about young people, particularly here today, they're at a place in their lives where grief changes you, right? But they're already going through a change. They're trying to find their place in the world, what their identity is, because they're separating from parents. Because they're separate from us, they want to find who they are in the world and who they are as people. And then this thing gets thrown at them, this great woof, to add to all the emotions that they're feeling, that they're struggling with, to navigate those emotions anyhow with growing up and finding their place in the world. And then this happens. So maybe a good starting point, Nicola, to give us an overview really of where young people are developmentally and what they're facing before we even get to the grief conversation.
Yeah, well, just to respond to what you were saying before, young people, I've heard them being called invisible mourners, because sometimes their behaviour doesn't look like mourning. Yeah. And people think that they've gotten over it or moved on, and they're not doing things that adults would do. So I think that description's quite apt. And also what you were saying before about not having the ABC. Yeah, I consider as a therapist, and it's probably the same role for parents and caregivers, that my role is to walk alongside the person through their grief and to make it easier to bear and to bear witness to it. And as a parent or caregiver or someone who cares for a grieving child, it can be extremely distressing to watch that child go through grief, and our natural response is to want to fix it and make it better. And I completely understand that, but sometimes we can't. Yeah, so good to keep that in mind. Yeah. But in terms of developmentally, like you were saying, that time of adolescence is a time of individuation, and so you're finding that the young person is defining for themselves, or finding a mind of their own that's separate and yet rooted in their family and their schools and their friends. So they're individuating from having those dependent relationships and setting forth on a new life. So it's actually a time of anxiety, and it's a time of loss anyway. So, and there's often a lot of change going along with that, like changing schools or starting jobs, or it's tumultuous, and developmentally it's supposed to be. And we find also that in order to defend against these feelings of being attached or dependent on parents, they can engage in behaviours that seemingly push parents or caregivers away. But that's sort of a miscue. They tend to miscue us. They actually really, really still need their parents. They're just like toddlers and adults' bodies sometimes. So that's sometimes hard to see from their behaviour. And neurobiologically, we know that the thinking part of the brain isn't mature and is shut down, and the emotional part of the brain is amplified, and the emotions are very strong and they can change very quickly. And this is in sort of developmentally normal teenagers, let alone ones who are grieving. So grieving complicates it even more. And that's, I think, so Nic, you've produced a kit for teenagers talking about
this one,
grieving. Memories are forever, and that's a great kit, and I really recommend it. And as what I really like about it is it has practical steps and recommendations, and even spaces for teenagers to fill in.
Yeah, we've got we've got it, it's like we can talk about it as we go through rather than me sort of showcasing. But I mean, we've got hard copies of these that we can distribute, to anybody that's online today. And once when you just drop us an email, but I'm not gonna here and just show you the book, but it is here. But me and Nicola will be talking about some really key points that are in here, practical resources that that we can send out to you. And these are really great, again, because they're like an A5, it's something that they can have for themselves and refer to. And it's all about empowering them, because they, like young adults, just like we as adults, we want information. So from an intellectual level, they want to have stuff that they know that can help them and they can refer to. And it's and it's specifically done, with young Kiwis in mind, Kiwi kids, within New Zealand and Aotearoa. So yeah,
and what's good about it is it does give, when emotions get amplified and it's hard to engage the thinking brain, hard to frame what's happening, hard to plan, the book just provides a very simple and accessible way of working through grief in a healthy way, instead of doing some of the other things that might not be so healthy.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that's sort of a good place to start with, Nicola, when you're talking about where they're at developmentally, and we're even to start with helping kids from the basic things. It's like we want to fix grief, but even from the basics, it's making sure your own self-care is looked after, and it's right making sure your body is functioning as best as it can. That can be hard to get teenagers to eat right. Can you get them to sleep right? Can you get them to exercise with their friends? But again, this is where, as you said, Nicola, where they're coming away from their parents, but that's where really a good family friend or a mentor needed to be their coach, or another adult that they respect and look up to, can be the one just sort of helping them along. It's like when it comes to their eating, not because if it comes from mum or dad, it's like, or we're nagging them to eat, and do not set a big plate of food down in front of them. It's like, if you're grieving, you don't want a big plate of food. It's just something you can pick at and nibble at. You know what I mean? Small things, to make sure they're eating right. Sleep hygiene is going to be a really tough one to explain for. I don't know if you've got ideas on this one, Nicola, but I think having a mentor and family friend to help guide that one, because young adults, they're up late at night, they're on their devices, and they're also, gaming, so it's hard to get sleep hygiene, I suppose, with some, but it is, getting their exercise and being with their friends. And I think it's something that adults can model in the home anyhow, if you're modeling those behaviors yourself of how you're looking after your body, because if your body isn't working that well, it's going to be very hard to regulate your emotions, because you can become overwhelmed. Excuse me, I've got the dog in the house. This is what happens when you're doing a live webinar.
So got something to say.
Yes, Billy has got something to say. Billy the dog is named after Billy Connolly, because Billy Connolly made me laugh whenever I was going through grief, because you cannot cry and laugh at the same time, and you can't be angry and laugh at the same time. And that was the tip I heard for young adults when they're feeling angry, to help them cope with that big emotion of anger, because anger is often a result of hurt. And they said funny YouTube clips, actually, to be able to sit down and watch that actually is a good point. And the other thing they suggested was, and you might have an idea of this, Nicola, from a practical point of view, for helping when young people are feeling angry, and helping them regulate it, instead of getting into a loop of rage that we can get into is when you're grieving. It's when you notice it in your body, those feelings, name it. I am feeling angry because this has happened to me. This is not fair. This is not right. And express it and get out there, get moving. Need to be, you join kickboxing or get out for a run, or you scream into a pillow, and journaling it and writing it down as well was another good tip. And breathing in for 7 and out for 11. I hadn't heard of that. The deep breathing to really help you deal with the rage. And of course, watching the funny YouTube clip. I thought those were really good practical things, even for adults, that we can, showcase to. What's your thoughts on that one, Nicola? Any other suggestions?
Well, I was actually thinking with your dog.
Yeah.
A lot of people like talking to animals and being with animals. So that might be something that your teenager enjoys doing.
Yeah.
And also with the sleeping. So my thought around that is, as you said, teenagers aren't always into parents telling them what to do. Don't like too many words. So I would try and set up routines for the household.
Yeah.
So there doesn't need to be a lot of talking every day about
Yeah.
when you're going to bed and when you're eating and what you're eating,
Yeah.
because it's predictable
Yeah.
and it happens the same every day, and the meal is provided at a similar time.
Yeah.
And you might have the Wi-Fi gets turned off at this time every day. And so that becomes a routine, and it just becomes something that doesn't have to be talked about. So it just becomes part of the day.
And that's actually a really good thing, because our bodies like routine, don't they, as well? So it's actually a really good way of getting into it. And the other thing, I suppose, when you're thinking of young people, and it's a general thing about how girls and guys deal with it. I mean, I've heard like girls tend to, and these are generalizations, that girls tend to ruminate over things. So that's how they process. We will think about things. We will think about things over again. Where guys tend to, right, we want to fix it. Restorative, right, I want to do. It's an action thing. It's a physical thing, and that's how. So then, when it comes to maybe even with the anger, then guys can get quite physical with it, because that's their outlet, that's their default. Where girls can be a bit more passive aggressive whenever they're trying to process their hurt and their anger. Thoughts on that one, Nicola? It's use similar thoughts or
well, I always think of feelings, behavior is driven by feelings. So and as I said before, feelings, behaviors in young people can have what should we say, a driver behind them is actually to push adults away and to create a sense of independence. And young people don't like the feeling often of being dependent. So if they get those feelings, they will often react to them by pushing people away when they actually need people with them. So they can miscue us in that way.
Yeah.
And what we have a tendency to do is, because these behaviors can be so hard to be around and they can be very triggering for us, is we get emotional in response and we lose our ability to connect and to think about what's happening for the young person. And so I would encourage you to see the behavior as a communication and to be curious about what is the meaning of the behavior. What is it in aid of? Is it something that they're doing to avoid feeling? Is it something that they're doing to protect the adults in the family? Because I often find with my clients that they will keep certain things to themselves because they know that adults are grieving and they don't want to hurt them anymore. So they might be keeping things in that actually need to be talked about. So I just think being curious and keeping them in mind and thinking about what might be going on for them.
Yeah, because it's interesting you mentioned about what's going on, even though we've had very open conversations in our household, and it's like, recently, because I'm on a transplant list, so we have the plan for the worst, hope for the best. So we had open and honest conversations with Connor about what's happening. Worst case scenario is planned for, but what I didn't say to him was the funeral plan, right? So something came on TV, and I went, "Don't worry, Connor, I've got the funeral sorted. You know what I mean? It's all planned." And I said, "Oh, thank God for that." I was really worried about that. But again, because I thought I communicated everything, but he didn't say to me, "Mum, what's going to happen if?" But there was still an area where he was concerned about, so he didn't, but he still didn't bring it up. And there was me thinking we had an open and honest, so it was something he was stressing about, and he was quite. And at the start, he was quite angry. I was getting the brunt of his anger to me, because of what was happening. So I could relate. So I can relate to what's happening for other families. And there was me thinking as well that, so it's remembering to ask the questions as well, and listen to what they're telling you. And as you said, what the behaviors are showing, it is a form of communication. Yeah.
And I was also, as we're talking about before, Nic, particularly where you might have a scenario where a parent is going to die soon, or or that is a potential worry for the child, you may find that they unconsciously will want, in effect, to leave the parent before the parent leaves them. So they will be creating distance, potentially, through their behaviour, so that to protect themselves.
Yeah, and that could be very hurtful for the parent as well, going through that, because you want to create those memories and that special time with them, but understanding that's not. Yeah. I suppose, in that is that where you recognizing that developmentally where they're at is, if you're living grief, if you're in that phase of living grief where the parent hasn't yet died, or that your loved one in the family hasn't died, and they are distancing, do you write a letter that's something that they can get when they're older, because they may look back, at a development stage and wish they'd done something differently? So it's, thinking of that as a future, strategy for the young adult, so they don't then have to sort of think, I wish I'd done things differently at that point.
For the young person?
Yes. It's the letter for the young person from the parents. So it's like the young whenever they're older, they get to have the letter from the parent that's died, because as they get older, they might reflect on the time in their life where they were doing that thing, as you said, distancing themselves at that point, because that's what they do as a self-protection mechanism for them. But then if that happens when they're 14 or 15, and then 6 or 7 years later or longer, when they look back and they wish, they have regret, how they process their parents' death. That was just
That's a good point, because that's the other thing, is that as they reach different developmental stages, they'll think about the loss in different ways, and they reflect on it in different ways. So having that being held in mind by their parents, particularly by one who might have passed away, would be hugely helpful. If we can keep that in mind, even if they can't see it. Yeah,
because the thing that was what somebody said to me, it's like, because they may look back and have regret, but it's what they were doing at that point in time in their development, and it's not, they don't have a fully formed adult brain at this point in time. So it's recognizing those behaviors. It's not to take it so personally, and it can be hurtful, and recognizing that dynamic, in the family. And and I've also said, and I've also been sort of on that note, whenever we're hurt and we're upset and the anger's going as well, sometimes you can have a blow up verbal argument, because sometimes that's just what you need. But then you've got to go, it's like, okay, we've had a blow up. Do you take an hour away, 2 hours, or 24 hours, and you come back, and then when we're all calm, and then have a conversation about, it's like recognizing what was said yesterday and working through those hurt feelings, because it can be a catalyst then for having those difficult conversations that you might not have had.
Yeah, I think rupture is normal. Repair is the important part. So take the time, so you're both in the right space, and come back to it, try and reconnect. And it's okay to say, I got it wrong, and I made a mistake, and I overreacted, validate whatever the young person might express to you in terms of their feelings, because no feeling's right or wrong. And for you to validate however they're feeling will be very important for them.
And the way we've done the kits, Nicola, it's within the framework as well. So you want to talk about sort of all those aspects of like our physical well-being, the emotional well-being, and you sort of covered that off a little bit in the is there anything you want to expand on that?
Well, the kit's based on one model of health, which makes a lot of sense, Te Whare Tapawhā, and that talks about there being 4, well actually there's 5 dimensions of health. So there's taha whānau, which is family, taha tinana, which is physical well-being, taha hinenaro, which is mental well-being, taha whenua, which is being connected to land and environment, and taha wairua, which is spiritual connection. And the kit goes through and looks at each of those and provides some ideas to think about for each of those dimensions of well-being, and particular around grief.
Oh, the other thing I thought, which was a nice thing, just on that note, when we're talking about grief, Nicola, is, you know, when our days are busy, and it's sometimes it's getting an idea of how do we remember our loved ones, especially if someone has died, and it's like, and I think it's saying it's okay to take some time out every day if you need it to remember our person that's died, you know what I mean, and keeping those memory alive. So, and that's about defining sort of, you know, rituals, you know what I mean, that family rituals, but even during the day, it's like, you know, for me, it would just be sitting with, you know, a piece of Kenzie's clothing, because it's the smell, the scent just unlocks that closeness, and it's that being able to touch them, and it breaks through the numbness of death, really, when you can really sort of feel them close, and it's having that time, or it's their playlist, their music that you enjoyed, and it's that can also be, and people listening to you may have some wonderful suggestions that you found quite helpful to just connect and be with that person that's died. Nicola, what's your thoughts on some of the young people you have supported, what they've found helpful in connecting and keeping that connection close to their loved one?
Some people find that each of the children like to have a box of special mementos that they've chosen from the loved one's belongings, or even that things that they may come across that remind them of their loved one that they keep in the box, and then when they're missing their loved one, they can get the box out and have a look through. And smells very evocative, so that can be very helpful for some. I find that some young people, as they get older, and you know, time's kind of different for them, they reach different milestones, they start to get worried that they can't remember, or that they're losing, they can't remember what dad looked like anymore, or they feel guilty about it. So that's sort of something to be worked through. And I think a conversation around that doesn't mean that you love them any less, or it doesn't mean it's normal that might happen, and you still remember the feeling of them being with you, and the feeling of doing things with them, even though you might not remember the details.
I mean, and that's the hard thing. That's the cruel thing about time, actually, because time dulls our senses. It's a physiological thing. It does dull our senses, and that's where those things can be eroded. So, you know, and that's the cruel thing. It's sort of like time sort of erodes, you know, the person ever being, but they live on in you, and the memories that you create need to be the rituals that you create within your family to remember that person. So you're not being able to, you know, the scent will only last on clothes for so long, and never wanting to wash that or item of clothing, and or whatever ritual that you've, like, it's even for me, it's like, and for Connor, 17 years on, the memories we've got are from videos that, you know, or this, and it's their voice. And that's why I think for lots of us, we don't get rid of a voicemail message, because it's remembering their voice. But fortunately, I suppose in the era of social media, we do actually have a lot of video, you know, most of us, where we will have that voice in perpetuity, you know, to be able to hear it, you know, and listen to it again. But you won't have their scent. But I think but it's recognizing that is the part of time, and it's not you feeling guilty. It's just that's what time does to the senses, and it erodes our senses. So it's not them forgetting. It's a physiological thing that our bodies do, and it's maybe the brain's way of protecting itself. I'm not sure. Or as your life, you know, grows around your grief in different ways, it's and I think we've had a couple of questions about how to use the kits. So I think, I mean, the kits, I mean, for young adults particularly, this is probably something for them as opposed to the younger kids. The younger kits that we've got for the 5 to 12-year-olds, that's probably something you would do more with an adult or caregiver. But this kit particularly is more designed for young people themselves, Nicola, or what's your thoughts on that? Or is it sit down with a parent?
I think it really depends on the young person. I mean, some of them might find that looking through the book is actually quite painful and can be quite hard. Like there might be some emotions, and so I wouldn't want them to be given the book and then they just go away with it and try and work through it on their own. Because really the stuff needs to be worked through in relationship. That's how we help our kids. And so I would try and work through it together,
Yeah.
particularly for younger ones.
Yes.
But you could just say, also, just have a conversation around the book with them, look through it, have a read through yourself first, and then you will pick up some things that might be hard for your young person, or you might think would be a good place to start. And then you could suggest that you look at that together. I would just sort of be a bit careful with it. I mean, if they're older, then I think probably more able to cope with some of it on their own.
I suppose we're looking at young adults, sort of 19, 20, 22, because, they go, but as you said, for younger ones, I mean, it's a nice also as well for have a conversation, isn't it? Well, because sometimes when it's hard to bridge those conversations, these are cues which you can actually help and, nurture those conversations about the loved one that's died and what has happened, and how, it's a really good way to keep those conversations flowing between the family and them letting you know how they feel, if they're feeling sad, what they're struggling with, and how things are going at school, and what it's like in their lives, you know what I mean? And that's a really good, I think, process, because it is all about the communication, isn't it, really? And it's because, I mean, when one of our young clients said to us a number of years ago, and he was such a wise young man, he said, when grief is shared, it feels less lonely. Yeah. And I think that's, if this is a tool then to share it, to express it, to be able to have those tough conversations. And these are hard conversations. It's a hard thing to deal with. And especially when we're all grieving alone, this is a way to grieve together in a way.
Well, it could be a conversation starter. And it could be a way to connect about how the young person's feeling in a kind of impartial way, I guess, or a non-threatening way. To sit side by side and look at the book, or maybe give it to them to look at and then come back and say, oh, what did you think? What were the things that most stood out for you? Or was there anything that you were surprised about? And see where they take the conversation.
And some people are asking as well, I mean, where do you do, when we say younger and we say older, I mean, the kids, this book particularly, because the younger, the other kit we've got is, we generally say 5 to 12-year-olds, which is a broad spectrum. And this is a broad area as well, because we've gone young adult, right? So sort of thinking 13, 14 plus. But the level of maturity, I mean, I think that each young person is different at their level of maturity. You can have a really mature, 15-year-old and a very immature 19-year-old. You know what I mean? So again, it's where I think that's whenever you sit down with your young person, I mean, it's really you will have the kid, and you will be able to read through it and have a look, and then the young person in your life that you want to have that conversation with, and you're the best judge. That's not us, because you know them best. You know what I mean?
There are no rules. It would depend on how recently the person's passed away, how many other losses that young person might have had, what their history has been, what their current relationships are like, what else is going on in their lives, rather than just a chronological age. So, and I think that the adults closest to them will be able to look at the book and probably get a sense of what they can cope with.
Yeah, and another thing, Nicola, sort of wanted to ask, I mean, this has come up before. It's like for young people, particularly, I've heard them whenever, how they deal with challenging conversations. I mean, whenever they go back to school, whenever they go back to work or university, I say, what do they say? Like, we as adults get it. If we've lost someone close to us, or one of our children, or our spouse, or our partner, people will often say insensitive things, right? So it's like, so have you got aren't you over your grief yet? Or do you have a brother? Do you have a sister? These sorts of, what do they say? Or is it, do they judge it in a way that what feels right for them, and helping them get their pattern for each situation? What's been your experience with young people when they've been facing challenging conversations, when they've got to explain their grief or what's happened to their family? How have they found it, or what's helped them?
Well, I think it can be quite overwhelming, especially when something happens suddenly or unexpectedly, or they've just come maybe back to school after someone passing away, and everyone will ask them questions. So I think, practicing beforehand what you might say, having a sort of generic response, maybe talking individually beforehand if you, maybe for younger children, if you know the friends and families, you could preempt some of the questions yourself with some of the families of your child's friends. But yeah, I mean, they've kind of got, I would say, two things. Firstly, they come up with some way to respond that they could just have off, that they remember.
Yeah.
Or just think, if in the moment, to connect with however they may be feeling and just be honest with the person. And it's okay to say, I don't want to talk about it, but thanks for asking.
Yeah.
And they don't have to reply.
Yeah, and I think it's right. It's them coming up with what they're comfortable with, and you can be put in some very uncomfortable positions, and it's like one like Connor's is used on occasion where he said it's people have asked, because again people tend to ask, so if you've got a brother or sister, they tend to always ask that question. They still, because it's like one child just doesn't fit the mold here. So Connor will go, Connor's gone, depending on what mood he's in and who's asked the question, he might go, no, it's just me. And then quick back, well, aren't you the lucky one? You get quite spoiled then being the only one. And then he, quick as a dash, has come back with, yeah, it's because my sister's dead. And it's like, he says, he's like, he doesn't care about making people feel uncomfortable. It's not his job to make people feel comfortable. And I think that's the point in that conversation as well. It's not our job to make people feel uncomfortable. If they're uncomfortable with the death conversation, that's not on you and that's not on your child. But I just thought that was an interesting, I mean, that's with years of it, and it depends on, because he just thinks they're being, what will set his trigger point, and this is years later, what will be his, and families may have also experienced it. I mean, Willow would have experienced it as adults, or young people would definitely have experienced it as well.
Isn't it a burden to have to worry about what other people are feeling as well as your own grief?
Yeah, and
I think that's what young people are faced with.
And that is the thing, is we're faced with it as adults, but they're also faced with it, and it's also equipping them as best we can, and letting them know, well, it's not up to you to make people feel comfortable. You know what I mean? That's on them, and it's not their job. And it's and I think, like many of our young adults as well, I mean, as you mentioned earlier on, Nicola, like they can be going about their normal lives, and we think, why are you not grieving? You're not upset, because for many young people, like, and Connor was the same. They don't want to be othered. They don't want to be different from their peers. They don't want to be the one with the dead sibling or the dead parent, or they don't want to be that. So how can that can be quite hard for a family as well. But how to help young people through that as well, Nicola? What's your suggestions there? Your thoughts?
They don't want to be othered. Yeah, well, that's very teenager. They don't want to be different. They don't want to stand out. Well, I guess, everyone, again, that's talking that through, and although they might, perhaps making them aware of the fact that many people are different and do have had losses, and they're not the only one. Even though they might, so we can acknowledge that they might feel like the only one, and that is really hard for a teenager to feel different, but that they're not the only one, and that they probably don't stand out as much as they think they do. Which is a good point. And on that, if it's making sure that that they're doing okay. But if you have got concerns, Nicola, like what would be triggers that you think, if with a parent or a professional that's working with a young person, then you start to have concerns, what should they be concerned about where you think actually they might need a bit more help here? What would some of the things that you might observe that you would think, well, actually maybe a bit of extra help outside of the home would be important and might be worthwhile? Thoughts? Well, I mean, obviously grief is going to disrupt their lives, but if you get to the point, and I mean, gosh, I was going to say, if they're not sleeping, if they're not eating, if they're unhealthy in any way, But if you're grieving, then that's quite likely that some of those things are happening. So yeah, I trust your gut instinct if things don't seem right, and then or if they're doing any risky behaviours like self-harming or abusing substances, then go to your GP and talk to them in the first instance. There's a helpline 1737. There's crisis lines. There is support for young people out there. Kenzie's Gift website. But yeah, and if you get a feeling of hopelessness and dread, what sort of feelings are coming up? And if I would just go with those. It's spoken like a psychotherapist, perhaps. And or get support. Just reach out to GP, Kenzie's Gift, helpline.
And have you anything else like you'd like to cover off, Nicola, that you think we haven't covered off? Any other thoughts that you had that you wanted to, that I might not have sort of put you on the spot about?
I think we've covered everything. I guess we haven't really covered a lot about whānau and spirituality. I think that to me that means a connection to something that's bigger than ourselves, and it's different. For some teenagers it might not be something they're interested in, but for others they may have a religion or a faith that helps them, or they may find themselves questioning that. And it can take the form of being connected to the land, being connected to the sea or nature. That can be very helpful for some young people, to spend time in that, to be connected with whānau, whakapapa, to go and spend time with extended family, and back to whenua or cultures, stories from your culture, and the rituals and the processes that come along with it can be incredibly holding and helpful.
And I think one of the questions here, Nicola, which is a point. I mean, it's some of the challenging conversations that we had around the way the person died, and if it was a sudden death, for example, that's all. I mean, it's and another tragic circumstances. So what about that? Because that's always really all death is hard, but some circumstances around a death can be challenging in more ways than
That's very true. Well, I don't know. I mean, you can't.
All death is hard regardless, but I mean,
it's hard to say one's harder than another. But in terms of explaining to people, then there are certain circumstances that you might feel embarrassed or potentially, I was going to say ashamed or uncomfortable about explaining.
I heard sudden death referred to the other week. I was listening to the Grief channel, and it was this, like, with sudden death being a heart attack of the brain, and I thought I liked that way where it was like, where, especially in relation to suicide, it was a heart attack of the brain, where it wasn't the person's fault, it was an acute event. You know what I mean? That was happened. It wasn't, something that they chose. It was, and for me, I just thought that was I like the way that was put. It might not be perfect, and and other people, it's I mean, it's definitely a hard one. We have got a kit on, and just talking about sudden death with young people. I mean, it's definitely not it's not an easy topic. But your thoughts on that, Nicola?
Well, I just think to be prepared for the questions and to come up together with what they might say, and to talk about how they might feel when the questions get asked.
Yeah, and sometimes the hard thing is when people get into the hows and the whys. You know what I mean? It can be, and again, that's sort of a thing. A developmental. You know what I mean? At what point? It's on what information is shared, really. But I mean,
and they don't have to answer questions. It's not their job to inform everyone who wants to know what happened.
Yeah,
so we can tell them that too.
Yeah, and then the other point was just rightly, it's a peer-to-peer, program, for young people to share in their grief, which is true that there is some peer-to-peer programs out there for young people so they don't feel alone. And there's some good online ones now. It's
Oh yeah, okay.
the Grief Gang was one I came across in the UK, for example. There's a few ones here as well. So there is actually some real good young peer-to-peer support programs, and run by young adults themselves. It's not run by adults for young people. It's actually run by young people for young people, which I think is really empowering, because it is their journey, and their journey is different from ours. You know what I mean? Everybody's experience is different because they're at a different life stage. And yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, of course, peer-to-peer support is great for kids and teenagers. If it's I would say supervised or moderated by an adult.
Yeah, well, I think it's so as I said, everyone, I mean, please feel free to drop us a line at hello@kenziesgift.com, and we can get these kits sent out to you, and we'll get them posted out. And Nicola, had you anything else? I think you were going to finish off with a nice poem again. We started with one, and it's
Well, I just had a whakatauki, aroha mai, aroha atu, love received and love given. That's all. Just love to everybody. Love to you, Nic, for the great work that you do.
Oh, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. And if you do have any other questions, we haven't been able to get some of your questions I've seen popped up, there'd be more of a response from Nicola. And we will get, if you email us those questions, we can get them to Nicola, and we can get those responded to in an email for you. And it's but thank you all so much for joining us. It's and we really appreciate you all being here. It's a tough subject, and it doesn't come with any easy answers, and there's no right way to do it. And we all are with you. Our love to you all going through this, and with your whānau and your families. And thanks to you all for joining.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.